within 24 hours of being sentenced to 35 years in prison for a high school track meet stabbing, Karmelo Anthony's defense team filed an emergency appeal. A single shove under a rain tent forever changed two families. But while the public clashes outside the courthouse, the legal reality of what happens next isn't what you expect. Here is what the media isn't telling you about the case. If you want the truth behind the headlines, hit subscribe to Top Crime Cases right now. We break down the real evidence, no fluff included. When we sit down and really look at this to understand the appeal, we have to look at the exact timeline of how this happened. We have to start with who Karmelo Anthony actually was before the trial even began. And I want to be very clear here, because we only deal with the facts. Public records and police statements confirm that before his arrest, Anthony had absolutely no prior criminal history. The court documents show he had no disciplinary records. None. At the time of the incident, he was just a 17-year-old student athlete at Centennial High School in Frisco, Texas. Public records indicate he was originally born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He was the oldest of 4 children, and his family relocated to North Texas back in 2021. At his high school, he was known as a leader. According to school records presented during the case, he served as the captain of both his school's football and track teams. This baseline is incredibly critical. It forms the foundation of his entire defense. We are looking at a teenager with a completely clean record who found himself in an escalating situation, right? And we really need to keep the human element in focus here. A life was lost. Austin Metcalf was also just 17 years old. The court heard the profound grief of his family. 2 families were permanently shattered that afternoon. Wow. It is just a very heavy reality to process. And you can't talk about the legal side without acknowledging the human loss on both sides. The intersection between Anthony and the victim, 17-year-old Austin Metcalf, happened at Kuykendall Stadium on April 2nd, 2025. During the trial, the core legal argument came down to a very specific debate: the legal definition of self-defense versus intentional murder under Texas state law. The defense argued forcefully that this was a split-second act of self-defense. They pointed out to the jury that Anthony did not initiate the physical contact. The defense lawyers argued he felt outnumbered while standing under a rival school's tent in the middle of a storm. And witness testimony confirmed that Anthony was visibly distraught immediately after realizing what had happened. The prosecution, however, stood before the judge and argued this was a clear case of intentional murder. Now, they established through legal statutes that carrying a pocket knife with a blade under 5.5 inches is completely legal under Texas state law. So possessing the knife was not the crime. But the prosecution argued that a physical shove from an unarmed teenager does not legally justify escalating a fight by introducing a deadly weapon. This brings up the first major legal debate that will heavily influence the emergency appeal. Was the use of deadly force legally justified under Texas law? Did the trial judge and the jury interpret the Texas stand your ground and self-defense laws correctly? Let's look at it from the prosecution's perspective, exactly as they presented it in the courtroom. Under Texas Penal Code Section 932, the state argued that deadly force is only justified if a person reasonably believes it is immediately necessary to protect themselves against deadly force. The prosecution told the jury that a physical shove or a verbal argument from an unarmed high school student simply does not meet the legal threshold of an imminent deadly threat. Because Metcalf was completely unarmed and only used his hands to grab or shove, the prosecution argued that pulling a knife was a legally disproportionate response. The state lawyers argued that bringing a knife to a physical shoving match shows a clear intent to cause serious bodily injury. But if you look at the defense perspective, they challenged this interpretation based entirely on the environment and the defendant's age. Anthony was a 17-year-old kid. The defense attorneys argued he was outnumbered under a rival school's tent during a chaotic, severe thunderstorm. They argued that fear impairs a person's immediate rational calculation. The defense presented the case to the jury that a reasonable person in that exact high-stress environment could easily perceive a physical assault by multiple rival individuals as a genuine threat of serious bodily injury. In their view, That perception of a threat legally justifies the defensive display or use of a weapon to protect oneself. When you read through the trial transcripts, you can see how both sides are looking at the exact same timeline of events, but applying completely different legal frameworks to it. The defense expert argued that the chaos of the rain, the rival team environment, and the sudden physical grab created a scenario where Anthony genuinely believed he was about to be seriously hurt. They emphasized the sudden passion provision in Texas law, arguing that the physical provocation initiated by the victim triggered a frantic, split-second reaction, not a calculated murder. On the flip side, the prosecution countered this by focusing on the words spoken right before the physical contact. The state reminded the jury of the witness testimony where Anthony said, "Touch me and see what happens." The prosecution argued that this statement proved Anthony was anticipating a physical altercation and was ready to escalate it to a deadly level. They argued to the judge that you cannot claim self-defense when you issue a warning and then immediately use a lethal weapon against an unarmed person who only uses their hands. This is the complex reality of the courtroom. It is a very technical debate over what constitutes a reasonable belief of a deadly threat. The judge had to instruct the jury on how to interpret these specific laws. And now the appellate court will have to review those exact instructions to see if any legal errors were made. Public records do not definitively confirm what was going through Karmelo Anthony's mind in that exact second, which is why the jury had to rely solely on the witness testimonies and the legal definitions provided by the court. We have to remember that throughout this entire process, two families were sitting in that courtroom listening to every single detail. The Metcalf family dealing with the unimaginable loss of Austin, and the Anthony family watching their oldest son face decades in prison. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, as documented by multiple news reports covering the trial. The human experience here is profound, and the pain on both sides is something that court transcripts can only capture a fraction of. So, as the defense files this emergency appeal, they are banking on the argument that the jury failed to properly weigh that high-stress environment and the physical provocation. They are arguing that the legal threshold for self-defense in Texas should protect a teenager who was grabbed while outnumbered by a rival group. But the state stands firm on their conviction that a shove does not equal a death sentence, and the jury agreed with them. We are watching a deeply complicated legal battle unfold, one that tests the very limits of how we define self-defense, provocation, and reasonable fear under the law. We just walked through all the intense legal arguments both sides presented regarding that fatal afternoon, right? Now we have to look at how that actually played out in the courtroom when it came time for a decision. The swift conclusion of the Collin County trial took place in June 2026. It was specifically on June 9th. After a full 7-day trial where the jury heard from eyewitnesses, responding police officers, and legal experts, both the prosecution and the defense rested their cases. They handed the heavy burden over to the citizens sitting in the jury box. You know, when you have a 7-day trial filled with incredibly complex arguments about self-defense, physical provocation, and state laws, you might naturally expect the jury to sit back in that deliberation room for days. They had stacks of court transcripts, witness statements, and physical evidence to review. But that is not what happened here. According to the official court records, the jury returned a verdict in less than 3 hours. Wow. Just think about that for a second. Under 3 hours to decide the legal fate of a teenager. When a deliberation is that fast, it usually tells the court that the jury was not heavily divided on the facts of the case. They completely rejected the defense's argument of self-defense. They simply did not buy the narrative that the chaotic thunderstorm environment and the physical shove from Austin Metcalf legally justified pulling a deadly weapon. When they came back into the courtroom, the foreperson read the decision. They found Karmelo Anthony guilty of first-degree murder. I want to pause right here and just acknowledge the human side of that exact moment. We are talking about genuine empathy for everyone sitting in that courtroom gallery. On one side of the aisle, you have Austin Metcalf's family. They just sat through 7 agonizing days of hearing exactly how their 17-year-old son died. They are looking for accountability. They are looking for some kind of justice for a life that was permanently taken away from them before it even really started. Then, on the exact same day, on the other side of the aisle, you have Karmelo Anthony's family. They are watching their oldest son, a kid who had absolutely no prior criminal record, be convicted of the highest degree of murder. I see how heavy that is. A single shove under a rain tent forever changed both of these families, and that courtroom reality is just incredibly devastating. Two families walked into that building hoping for peace, and both walked out with a permanent sense of loss. Now, the judicial process did not stop with the reading of the verdict. Hours after reading that guilty verdict, the exact same jury was tasked with the sentencing phase. This is where the legal boundaries get very specific, and it is important to understand how Texas law works in these situations. Because Anthony was 17 years old at the time of the offense, capital murder charges and the death penalty were legally off the table. The judge instructed the jury on their available options. Under Texas law, for a first-degree murder conviction, he faced a punishment range of anywhere from 5 to 99 years in a state prison. The defense was hoping the jury might consider a lesser manslaughter charge during their deliberations, which would bring that number down significantly. But the jury bypassed the option of a lesser manslaughter charge entirely. They looked at the massive matrix of 5 to 99 years, and they settled right in the middle of it. The jury officially handed down a 35-year prison sentence. So we are looking at a teenager who will spend his entire adult life behind bars before he is even eligible to re-enter society. When you think about it, the jury had a massive responsibility. If they chose 5 years, the public outcry would have been that justice was completely ignored. If they chose 99 years, the defense would argue it violates the spirit of the law for minors. They landed on 35. Why not subscribe to Top Crime Cases right now to keep getting the honest, unbiased legal truths we uncover every single week? Let us continue. The fallout from this verdict and the 35-year sentence was immediate, and it was massive. We are not just talking about local news coverage in Collin County anymore. When the verdict hit the news, it went viral. Public reactions flooded every corner of social media and national news outlets. People were heavily divided on whether justice was actually served or if the system fundamentally failed. High-profile commentary started pouring in from all over the country. This included statements from celebrities like Cardi B, who used her massive platform to highlight the severe racial tensions surrounding the case. When celebrities weigh in on local court cases, it turns a regional tragedy into a national talking point, forcing everyone to look at the demographics of the justice system. And you really cannot talk about this public fallout without addressing those demographics directly. According to the verified case files, Anthony is black and Metcalf was white. The protests and the massive public outrage out in the streets centered heavily on the seating of an all-white jury in Collin County. People were raising very loud, very public questions about fairness and bias in the judicial system. They were openly debating whether an all-white jury could impartially judge a case involving a black defendant and a white victim, especially when the defense was arguing self-defense in a high-stress altercation. They were demanding to know how jury selection allowed for a panel with zero minority representation in a case carrying this much racial and social weight. This leads directly to the next major question surrounding the case, and it is the core debate that the defense team is currently focusing on for their appeal. Was a 35-year sentence actually appropriate for a minor with no prior record? Did the jury focus too heavily on retribution rather than rehabilitation? To fully understand this debate, we have to look at the legal boundaries established by the highest court in the land. The legal boundary for first-degree murder in Texas is strict, as we discussed. While the punishment range is 5 to 99 years, there is a very important U.S. Supreme Court precedent set in a landmark case called Miller v. Alabama. That precedent dictates that an automatic life without parole sentence is strictly unconstitutional for anyone who was under the age of 18 at the time of the crime, right? The Supreme Court basically ruled that juvenile brains are still developing. They stated that minors have an underdeveloped sense of responsibility and are much more vulnerable to high-stress situations. Because of this, the justice system has to account for their capacity to change and grow. The jury had to factor this exact legal precedent in when they chose a number between 5 and 99. Because of all these factors, the verdict debate remains highly divided today. If you listen to the critics of the 35-year sentence, they argue that it is excessively harsh. They point directly to the court records showing we have a high school student with a completely clean record. He had a documented history of athletic leadership as a team captain. He had absolutely no prior history of violence. None. The defense supporters argue that handing down a 35-year sentence to a 17-year-old completely ignores the potential for rehabilitation. The word rehabilitation means the prison system is supposed to correct the behavior and provide a path back to normal life. They believe the system is just locking him away for decades as pure, unadulterated punishment, without considering that he was a minor reacting in fear during a chaotic thunderstorm. They argue that putting a high school athlete into the hard prison system for 3.5 decades does not leave room for him to grow, learn, and eventually return to society as a reformed adult. But then you have to look at the other side of the courtroom. Proponents of the sentence, including the prosecution and the victim's family, argue that 35 years is the absolute correct legal response. They argue that it accurately reflects the permanent loss of Austin Metcalf's life. The word retribution means punishment for the act committed. The prosecution stated clearly that Metcalf does not get a second chance to grow up, go to college, or start a family, so the sentence must reflect that terrible finality. Furthermore, they maintain that a 35-year sentence serves as a highly necessary societal deterrent. The state wants to send a very clear, uncompromising message to the public. They argue that this strict sentence acts as a powerful deterrent against teenagers carrying weapons to school-sanctioned sporting events. The prosecution's stance is that regardless of whether the pocket knife itself is legal to own under Texas law, bringing it to a high school track meet and using it to escalate a physical shove demands strict, heavy retribution from the court. We are looking at two completely different views on how the justice system should handle a tragedy of this magnitude. One side is asking the court to look at the teenager's clean past and his potential future. The other side is asking the court to look strictly at the finality of the crime and the absolute need to protect the community from armed altercations. The jury made their decision, but as we will see when we get into the appeal process, the legal battle over what happens next is far from over. With that 35-year sentence officially handed down and the courtroom cleared out, the focus in this immediately shifts to the appeal. When you look at the news or social media, people are yelling from both sides, but we have to block out the noise and look exactly at what the court documents say is happening right now. Filing an appeal does not mean Karmelo Anthony gets a new trial right away. I see this misconception all the time when high-profile cases hit the news. People think an appeal is just a quick do-over, like pressing a reset button, right? But that is not how it works. The legal roadmap of a Texas criminal appeal is an incredibly slow, highly methodical process. It takes years, not days. Step 1 is the notice of appeal. The defense team filed this notice within 24 hours of the sentencing. Now, some people looked at that and thought it was some kind of dramatic legal loophole, but the court said it is actually standard legal procedure. It is done strictly to preserve the defendant's constitutional rights. When you file that piece of paper, it pauses the finality of the court's judgment. It officially signals to the state of Texas that the defense intends to challenge the outcome of the trial. Step 2 involves appraising the record. This is where the waiting game truly begins. The defense team will now spend months just waiting for the official court reporter transcripts to be fully compiled and delivered. Think about it. We are talking about a 7-day trial. Every single word spoken by the judge, the lawyers, and the witnesses has to be typed out, verified, and bound. Once the defense lawyers finally get their hands on the full written record, they will sit down and comb through every single page. And this is a really crucial point to understand. When they read those transcripts, they are not looking to re-argue the facts of what happened under that rain tent at the track meet. The appellate court is not a jury. They do not care about reweighing who shoved who first. Instead, the defense attorneys are searching for judicial errors made by Judge John Roach Jr. during the trial itself. An appeal is based entirely on mistakes in legal procedure, not just a disagreement with a jury's final decision. Wow, that is a heavy reality for the Anthony family to accept. They have to prove the judge made a legal mistake. Otherwise, the 35-year sentence stays exactly as it is. And you really have to feel for both families caught in this waiting period. For the family of Austin Metcalf, they went through the absolute agony of a trial, got a conviction, and now they are forced to wait years to find out if that conviction will even hold. The human experience of the justice system is exhausting. Every time there is an update in the appeal, they have to relive the day they lost their 17-year-old son. Step 3 of this process is the formulation of the projected arguments. Legal experts indicate that Anthony's defense team will likely base their appeal on 2 main pillars. We need to break down exactly what the defense will argue and how the state will respond using only the verified facts of the law. The first pillar is what the court calls self-defense manifest weight. Basically, the defense will argue that the jury failed to properly weigh the evidence according to the law. Under Texas law, there is a provision called sudden passion. The defense attorneys will argue that the jury completely failed to adequately consider the physical provocation initiated by the victim when he grabbed Anthony. They will point to the trial transcripts where witnesses testified that Metcalf made the first physical contact. The defense perspective is that a teenager being shoved by a rival team member in a chaotic storm triggers a sudden, fearful reaction. They will tell the appellate court that the jury's decision to completely ignore this physical provocation goes against the manifest weight of the evidence. But remember, the state gets to fight back on this appeal. The prosecution will point right back to the police reports and the court records. They will maintain that a simple shove does not legally justify drawing a 3.5-inch pocket knife. The state will argue to the appellate court that the jury got it absolutely right. They will say the jury listened to all the evidence, looked at the laws provided by the judge, and correctly decided that Anthony's response was intentional murder, not sudden passion. Then we get to the second pillar of the appeal, and this is perhaps the most heavily debated issue in the entire case. This pillar focuses entirely on jury selection prejudices. The defense is expected to legally challenge the striking of minority jurors, which ultimately led to an all-white panel deciding fate of a black defendant. This brings us to the final major debate of the entire ordeal. Why did the judge allow an all-white jury to be seated? And was it a legal error to do so? Did the jury selection process violate the constitutional right to a fair trial by an impartial peer group? To understand this, we have to look at the procedural reality of jury selection, which the court calls voir dire. During this phase, before the trial starts, both the prosecution and the defense get to question dozens of regular citizens. Both sides are allowed to strike potential jurors from the pool if they think those people will be biased. But there is a specific rule. The prosecution utilized what are known as peremptory challenges. These are specific legal strikes that do not require the lawyers to give a reason for removing a candidate. You just use your strike and that juror goes home. During this process in the Anthony trial, minority candidates were systematically eliminated from the jury pool by the state. Now, the defense team did not just sit there and let this happen quietly. The legal argument for the appeal centers around a very specific procedural move they made right then and there. During the trial, the defense stood up and raised what is called a Batson challenge. If you don't know what that is, a Batson challenge officially accuses the state of striking jurors based solely on their race. Under a previous U.S. Supreme Court ruling, kicking someone off a jury just because of their skin color is strictly unconstitutional. I see how critical this moment was in the courtroom. When this challenge was raised, everything stopped. Judge John Roach Jr. Looked at the prosecution and legally required the state to explain their peremptory strikes. The state had to stand up and give the court a verified race-neutral reason for sending every single one of those minority jurors home. According to the court records, the prosecution provided their reasons. We don't have all the specific details of what those reasons were, but we know the outcome. Judge Roach Jr. listened to the state, and he ultimately ruled that the prosecution provided valid non-racial reasons for eliminating those specific minority jurors. He denied the Batson challenge, and the all-white jury was officially seated. This is exactly what the appellate court is going to scrutinize. The massive debate for the higher court is whether they will look at those trial transcripts, review the state's exact given reasons for striking those minority jurors, and decide if Judge Roach Jr. committed an abuse of discretion by accepting the state's explanations. Think about how much weight is riding on this one procedural review. The appellate judges are going to read the exact words the prosecutors use to justify their strikes. If the appellate court determines that the state's reasons were actually just a cover for racial bias, and if they decide the judge made a legal error in how he handled that Batson challenge, the consequences are massive. It could be grounds to overturn the conviction entirely. If the court rules that the jury selection was unconstitutional, the 35-year sentence gets thrown out, and the court will order a brand new trial from scratch. But if the appellate court looks at the record and says, no, the judge did his job correctly and the state followed the rules, then Karmelo Anthony's conviction stands and the reality of his 35-year sentence sets in permanently. This case is a tragic collision of self-defense laws, racial dynamics, and the heavy consequences of a single chaotic moment between two high school kids. We will be watching the dockets closely to see exactly what the appellate court decides in the coming months. Thank you for staying till the end of this case. Please subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss the next video breakdown.